Drone pilot films 19-foot Bigfoot dismembering moose. Then it noticed him. He thought it was just another survey flight, another routine job documenting wildlife in the backcountry of Idaho. But when the drone hovered over a clearing, the camera caught something no one was prepared to see. A creature massive, upright, close to 19 feet tall, tearing into a moose like it was nothing. At first, the footage looks impossible. The size, the power, the way it moved with purpose, not like an animal, but like something that knew it was being watched. And then everything shifted. The head turned. The shoulders rose. It looked directly at the drone. That's when the fear set in, because what started as undeniable evidence quickly became a personal nightmare. If it could sense the drone, what would it do to the man operating it, hidden only a mile away in the trees? So here's the question. When you capture proof of the impossible, do you run with Aitor? Does the impossible come looking for you? You being here means more than you know. If your heart still makes room for wonder and gentleness, then you're already one of Usmai's hands. We're still shaking as I made my way to where the drone had gone down. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees, and every rustle of branches made me flinch. After about 20 minutes of careful navigation using the drone's last known GPS coordinates, I spotted the distinctive white body of my DJI against the dark forest floor. The drone lay in a small clearing, remarkably intact despite its erratic descent. I knelt beside it, trying to maintain my professional composure as I checked for damage. The propellers were slightly bent, but otherwise, the hardware seemed sound. I removed the SD card with trembling fingers, inserted it into my backup reader, and connected it to my laptop. Come on, I muttered, watching the loading screen. Error messages popped up immediately. The file structure was there, but most of the video files were corrupted, fragmented data that wouldn't play properly. I managed to salvage a few clips, but they were broken into disjointed segments, none showing what had caused the drones malfunction. I packed everything away methodically, fighting the urge to rush. The sun was getting lower, and I needed to get back to my truck before dark. The temperature was already dropping, and the shadows seemed to grow deeper with each passing minute. That's when I heard it, a sharp, deliberate sound that cut through the mountain air like a gunshot, but wasn't one, a knock. A powerful wooden knock that echoed across the timberline. My head snapped up, trying to triangulate the source. Before I could process it, another knock answered from a different direction. Further up the slope, these weren't random sounds. They had a rhythm, a purpose, like signals being passed back and forth. I'd heard woodpeckers plenty of times before, but this was different. These knocks were too loud, too measured, too intentional. I shouldered my pack and started walking, trying to maintain a steady pace despite my growing unease. The knocking continued sporadically, always seeming to come from different directions. It felt like they were creating a perimeter around me, though I tried to dismiss that paranoid thought. About half a mile into my hike back, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were tracks in a muddy section of the trail. Not my own boot prints from earlier, but something else. They paralleled my path, staying just off the trail in the softer earth. The stride length was enormous, and the impressions were deep, suggesting significant weight. Whatever made them had been walking alongside my original track, but I hadn't noticed them on my way out. I took out my phone and snapped several photos, placing my GPS unit next to the prints for scale. My hands were steady now, the methodical part of my brain taking over, falling back on protocol and documentation. but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, studied even. The knocking had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was somehow worse. The normal forest sounds, birds, small animals, wind in the trees, all seemed muted, as if the woodland itself was holding its breath. I kept walking, maintaining my pace, fighting the urge to run. Running would be the worst thing I could do right now. Whatever was out there, whatever was aware of my presence, I couldn't show fear. I checked my GPS again. Still 2 miles back to the truck. The tracks continued to parallel my path, sometimes disappearing where the ground was harder, then reappearing in softer patches. They were fresh, the edges of the prints still crisp, undisturbed by wind or wildlife. Something was keeping pace with me, just out of sight in the deepening shadows of the forest. Another knock echoed through the trees, closer this time, much closer. I gripped my bear spray tighter and kept walking, my eyes scanning the tree line. The rational part of my mind tried to catalogue everything I was experiencing, but another part was screaming that this was wrong, all wrong. Whatever was out here wasn't just following me, it was coordinating, communicating, and most terrifyingly of all, it was thinking. I parked my truck at the remote trailhead, as far from the tree line as the small clearing would allow. The sun had set, leaving me in the growing darkness with only my laptop's glow for company. My hands were still unsteady as I inserted the SD card again, hoping the card reader in my truck might somehow work better than the one in my field kit. Most of the files were still corrupted, showing only fragmented thumbnails that wouldn't load. But 3 clips played, albeit with significant digital artifacts. The first showed a normal sweep of the forest canopy, tracking moose movement as intended. The second clip started normally but ended in a blur of motion as the drone suddenly lost stability. It was the third clip that made my throat go dry. Despite the video corruption creating blocks of pixelation across the frame, I could make out something massive moving through the trees. The thermal imaging kicked in automatically due to the forest shadows, showing a heat signature that dwarfed the usual wildlife readings I was accustomed to. Whatever it was stood upright, its height easily surpassing 8 feet. The footage cut out just as the figure seemed to turn toward the drone. I played it again and again. Each time, I tried to convince myself it was a technical glitch or a misidentified bear, but the proportions were all wrong. The way it moved through the dense forest showed an intelligence, a deliberate purpose that no known animal in these mountains should possess. Sleep felt impossible, but I knew I needed to rest. I'd locked all the doors, double-checking them twice, and reclined my seat just enough to stay alert while trying to doze. The temperature had dropped significantly, and I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight. I must have drifted off despite my anxiety, because the first rock of my truck startled me fully awake. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it happened again, a deliberate movement that made the whole vehicle shift slightly on its suspension. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. That's when I heard it, a slow, methodical dragging sound across the roof of my truck. It moved from the back toward the front, directly above where I lay frozen in my reclined seat. The sound was like something between a scratch and a scrape, heavy enough to make the metal creak. Whatever was causing it had to be applying significant pressure. I didn't dare move. I didn't even reach for my phone to try recording the sound. The dragging continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, accompanied by occasional rocks of the truck that suggested massive weight shifting around me. Eventually, the sound stopped. I remained motionless until the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky. Only then did I slowly sit up, my muscles aching from being tensed for so long. I waited until full daylight, before finally stepping out of the truck. The morning dew had settled on the vehicle's surface, making the damage immediately visible. Along the roof, starting from the back and running toward the windshield, were 3 distinct parallel lines scraped into the paint. They were deep enough to have reached the metal in some places, spaced about 4 inches apart. They looked like claw marks, but larger than any bear could make, and bears don't typically stand tall enough to reach the roof of a full-sized pickup truck. I took several photos with my phone, making sure to place my hand in frame for scale. The marks were unmistakable in the morning light, and no amount of rational explanation could dismiss what I was looking at. Whatever had made those marks had been powerful enough to rock my truck and tall enough to easily reach the roof. The implications made me feel sick to my stomach. I drove straight to the Clearwater County Sheriff's Office as soon as it opened at 8 o'clock in the morning. The fluorescent lights and coffee-scented normalcy of the station felt surreal after my night in the truck. Deputy Sarah Martinez took my statement, her pen moving methodically across her notepad as I described the drone incident, the knocking sounds, and the damage to my vehicle. "And you're certain it wasn't a bear?" she asked, not looking up from her notes. "We've had several reports of them being more aggressive than usual this season. I've worked around bears for 3 years doing these surveys," I explained, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "The height alone rules that out." The thermal imaging showed something much larger, walking upright. Deputy Martinez set down her pen and gave me the kind of patient look usually reserved for children or the elderly. "Mr. Manson, you mentioned you were out there alone for several days. Fatigue can play tricks on the mind, especially in isolated conditions. That's why I brought the SD card and the drone fragments," I said, placing them on her desk. "The footage is corrupted, but there are still viewable sections." She examined the damaged drone components with mild interest before calling in Ranger Pete Collins, who happened to be at the station filing his own reports. The ranger was a weathered man in his 50s who'd worked these forests for over 2 decades that we gathered around Deputy Martinez's computer as I played the salvageable clips. The thermal imaging footage flickered across the screen, distorted but still showing that massive heat signature moving through the trees. "Digital artifacts," Ranger Collins said almost immediately. "These consumer-grade drones aren't built for dense forest conditions. The thermal imaging especially can get wonky when you're dealing with temperature inversions and canopy shadows." "But what about the scratches on my truck?" I pressed, "and the knocking sounds?" The ranger shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Deputy Martinez before responding. "Look, I'll level with you. We've had some unusual findings lately. Couple of elk carcasses turned up in places that don't make sense, broken in ways that don't match typical predator patterns. But there's always a rational explanation." "We'll file your report," Deputy Martinez added, already starting to organize the papers on her desk in a way that suggested our meeting was concluding. "If you experience any other incidents, please don't hesitate to call it in." I recognized the polite dismissal for what it was. They were humoring me, filing my report away where it would gather dust alongside other unusual encounters that didn't fit their acceptable explanations. "One more thing," Ranger Collins said as I stood to leave. "You mentioned you're contracted for the moose population survey. My advice would be to stick to the designated flight paths and maybe consider working with a partner going forward. These mountains can be disorienting when you're solo. I nodded, knowing any further protest would only reinforce their assumption that I was suffering from isolation-induced paranoia. As I walked back to my truck, I could feel the weight of their skepticism following me. The rational, evidence-based world I'd always operated in suddenly felt like it was built on shakier ground than I'd realized. The scratches on my truck's roof caught the morning sun, 3 distinct parallel lines that no bear could have made. But I was beginning to understand that official acknowledgement of what I'd experienced would never come. Whatever was out there in those mountains, I was now alone with the knowledge of its existence. I had no choice but to return to the field. The next day, the Wildlife Department contract was explicit about their survey requirements, and I couldn't afford to lose this job. My hands trembled slightly as I checked my drone equipment in the morning light. The memory of yesterday's encounter still fresh in my mind. The forest felt different now. What had once been a peaceful workplace had transformed into something watchful and oppressive. I chose a new survey location about 3 miles east of yesterday's incident, hoping distance might provide some safety. As I hiked up the logging trail, something caught my eye that I'd missed on previous trips. Tree breaks, but not the random kind you'd see from winter storms or natural decay. These were methodically stacked, almost like trail markers. The first one I spotted was about 8 feet up. A thick branch twisted and snapped in a way that seemed to point deeper into the forest. 50 yards further, I found another, then another, forming a distinct pattern. Just document everything, I muttered to myself, pulling out my phone to photograph the breaks. The scientific part of my brain tried to catalogue and rationalize, but my instincts were screaming that these weren't natural formations. That's when the smell hit me, a putrid, musky odor that reminded me of rotting meat mixed with wet fur. It was so intense I had to pull my shirt over my nose. But the strangest part was how it seemed to appear and disappear without any change in the wind direction. One moment it was overwhelming, the next completely gone, as if someone had flipped a switch. I set up my drone equipment with shaking hands, trying to focus on the technical aspects of my job, the familiar routine of checking battery levels and calibrating the sensors helped steady my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet. I'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know the normal rhythms of wildlife, but this was different. The usual background chorus of birds had fallen silent. Even the insects seemed to have gone quiet. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt an electric tension in the air that made my skin crawl. I launched the drone, keeping it lower than usual, worried about a repeat of yesterday's incident. Through the controller screen, I watched the thermal imaging sweep across the canopy. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't concentrate. Every few seconds, my eyes darted to the tree line. Searching for movement, a branch snapped somewhere behind me, too heavy to be a deer or elk. I spun around, nearly dropping the controller. Nothing visible, but the silence deepened. My professional training warred with my instincts. The rational part of my mind insisted I complete the survey pattern, gather the required data, but every fiber of my being wanted to pack up and run. Another crack, closer this time, followed by the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. The drone's battery warning chirped, demanding my attention. I had to make a choice, continue the survey or abort. My hands were sweating so badly the controller felt slippery. The smell returned, stronger than before, and with it came a deep, guttural sound just at the edge of hearing, not quite a growl, but something that made my chest vibrate. Professional pride crumbled in the face of raw animal fear. I initiated the drone's return to home sequence, keeping my movements slow and deliberate despite the panic building in my chest. The waiting was excruciating. Each second the drone took to return felt like an eternity. I could still hear movement in the forest around me, seemingly from multiple directions now. Whatever was out there, it wasn't trying to hide its presence anymore. It was letting me know I was in its territory. The drone's camera feed flickered as I guided it over a small clearing about half a mile ahead. Something large caught my eye, the distinct shape of a moose carcass lying on its side. I adjusted the drone's altitude to get a better look, thinking this could be valuable data for the Wildlife Department's predation study. What I saw next made my blood run cold. Crouched over the carcass was a figure that defied comprehension. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it as a bear, but the proportions were all wrong. It was standing upright, its massive frame towering over the moose carcass. Using the drone's reference markers and the known size of the moose, I estimated its height at nearly 19 feet, a measurement I triple-checked because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The creature's movements were what struck me most. There was nothing animalistic about the way it worked over the carcass. Its actions were deliberate, almost surgical. I could see what looked like primitive tools in its hands. Not just claws or brute force, but actual implements it was using to strip the meat from the bones. The methodical precision reminded me more of a butcher than a predator. My hands were trembling so badly, I had to set the controller down on a flat rock to keep the drone steady. The camera feed showed every detail in horrifying clarity, matted. Dark fur covering massive shoulders, muscled arms that looked as thick as tree trunks, and hands. Yes, hands, not paws, that moved with disturbing dexterity. I zoomed in slightly, trying to document every detail. The creature's head was proportionally small for its massive frame, with a pronounced sagittal crest that reminded me of prehistoric hominid reconstructions I'd seen in museums. Its face was partially obscured as it worked, but what I could see didn't look quite ape, didn't look quite human, something in between that shouldn't exist. Then everything changed. The creature's head snapped up, turning with deliberate slowness until it was facing directly at my drone. Even through the digital feed, the intelligence in its eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't the blank stare of a wild animal. There was awareness there, calculation, and what looked terrifyingly like anger. My heart nearly stopped. The creature rose to its full height, and even from the drone's elevated vantage point, it was like watching a building unfold itself. Its chest was barrel-wide, tapering to powerful legs that looked capable of covering ground faster than any human could hope to run. I hit the return to home button, but it was too late. The feed shook violently as something massive moved through the air toward the drone. I caught a glimpse of an enormous arm, a flash of movement, and then the video feed dissolved into static. The controller screen went black, then flashed a signal lost warning. My hands were shaking so badly now that I dropped the controller, watching helplessly as it clattered against the rocks at my feet. The silence that followed was deafening. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart in my ears. I stood frozen, my mind racing through the implications of what I'd just witnessed. The creature hadn't just noticed the drone. It had recognized it as a threat or an intrusion. It had made a deliberate choice to destroy it. And now, somewhere between me and that clearing, 19 feet of intelligent tool-using power, was likely very, very angry. The smell hit me again, that same musky, rotting odor from before, but stronger now, much stronger and closer. I spent the night in my truck at the ranger station parking lot, too wired to sleep but too exhausted to drive home. As the first hints of dawn began to paint the sky, I methodically checked my equipment one final time. The backup drone was my last functioning unit after this. I'd either have the proof I needed or I'd walk away from the contract entirely. My hands trembled slightly as I connected fresh batteries and verified the camera settings. The morning air bit through my jacket as I positioned myself on a ridge overlooking the valley where I'd lost the previous drone. The sun hadn't yet crested the mountains, but the pre-dawn light was enough to navigate by. I'd chosen this spot carefully, elevated, with clear sight lines in all directions, and my truck parked just 50 yards behind me, an escape route. If I needed it, the drone's rotors whirred to life, and I guided it up into the pearl grey sky. The camera feed showed the landscape below in crisp detail, stands of lodgepole pine, patches of mountain meadow, and the dark ribbon of a creek winding. Through it all, everything looked deceptively peaceful in the early light. I kept the drone high, at least 400 feet up, and began a systematic sweep of the area. The display showed the temperature at 38 degrees Fahrenheit, with minimal wind, perfect flying conditions. Almost too perfect, as if the wilderness was holding its breath. 20 minutes into the flight, I spotted the first anomaly. A series of trees had been broken at identical heights, creating what looked like a deliberate path leading toward a box canyon. The pattern was too uniform to be natural, too precise to be storm damage. My instincts screamed that I was looking at a trap, but I couldn't stop myself from following it. The drone's battery indicator showed 70%, remaining as I guided it along the line of broken trees. Each snap of a twig behind me, each rustle of leaves in the morning breeze, sent electric jolts down my spine. The wilderness felt different now, aware, almost predatory. The normal morning chorus of birds was conspicuously absent. That's when I noticed the shadows moving wrong at first. I thought it was just early morning mist, but the movements were too purposeful. Through the drone's camera, I could see dark shapes flowing between the trees, always just at the edge of clear visibility. They were herding me, I realized, with growing horror. Not physically, I was still safe on my ridge, but drawing my drone deeper into their territory. Using the broken trees as breadcrumbs, the smell reached me, even at my elevated position, that same putrid, musky odor that had haunted my previous encounters. It was stronger now, more pervasive, as if it was seeping from the earth itself. My eyes watered, but I kept them fixed on the controller screen. The battery indicator flashed 60%. As the drone reached the entrance to the box canyon, the walls rose steep and jagged on 3 sides, creating a natural amphitheater. The morning shadows still clung to its depths, but I could make out shapes that didn't belong, structures that looked like crude shelters arranged in a rough, simically movement caught my eye, something massive shifting in the shadows beneath the canyon walls. Then another movement on the opposite side. The drone's thermal imaging showed multiple heat signatures, all larger than any known wildlife in the region. They were positioned strategically, I realized, covering every possible exit from the canyon. I watched, paralyzed, as the heat signatures began to move with coordinated purpose. They weren't just reacting to the drone's presence. They were executing what appeared to be a practiced response. These creatures, whatever they were, had dealt with human technology before. They had learned. they had adapted the realization. Hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't documenting them, they were documenting me. Every flight, every encounter had been on their terms. They were studying my patterns, my technology, my limitations, and now they had me exactly where they wanted me. Through the drone's camera, I caught a flicker of movement that made my blood run cold. The figure stepped partially into view from behind a massive Douglas fir, and this time the camera locked. Onto it, even at this distance, I could tell it was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a bulk that dwarfed any bear I'd ever seen. The proportions were wrong for any known animal, too vertical, too deliberate in its movements. For 3 precious seconds, I had a clear view. The figure stood motionless, face obscured by shadow, but its stance was unmistakably aware, watching. The drone, watching me. Then the video feed erupted into static, the screen filling with digital artifacts and distortion. I frantically adjusted the controls, trying to restore the connection, but the interference only intensified. No, 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 I muttered, fingers flying over the controller. The drone's position indicator was still working, showing it hovering in place, but the video feed was completely gone. I initiated the return to home function, praying the autopilot could guide it back. That's when I heard it, a sharp, crisp crack that echoed across the valley. A wood knock, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. Another knock answered from my right, closer, maybe 200 yards away. A third response came from behind me, closer still. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the controller. The knocks continued, forming a perimeter around my position. This wasn't random animal behavior. This was coordination, communication. They were surrounding me. The drone's motors whined in the distance, growing louder as it approached on autopilot. But I couldn't stay to recover it. More knocks sounded, accompanied by the snap of branches and the distinct sound of something large moving through the underbrush. The circle was tightening. I shoved the controller into my backpack and turned toward my truck. 50 yards had never felt so far. I forced myself to walk quickly but steadily, fighting the urge to run. Running would be worse, I knew that instinctively. The way prey animals know not to flee too soon. The morning silence had become absolute. No birds, no squirrels, not even the whisper of wind through the trees. Just the rhythmic knocking drawing closer, and the sound of my own breathing, too loud in my ears. 30 yards to the truck. Something large moved in my peripheral vision. Just a shadow, but enough to send my heart racing. The knocks were coming faster now, almost like a language. 20 yards. I could hear heavy footfalls in the pine needles, circling, circling. The truck keys were already in my hand. Thumb on the unlock button. 10 yards. A deep, guttural sound came from the tree line. Not quite a growl, not quite human. 5 yards. The electronic chirp of the doors unlocking seemed obscenely loud in the unnatural quiet. I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut and hitting the lock button in one frantic motion. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw the truck into reverse. Tires spraying gravel as I backed onto the access road. Through the windshield, I caught a glimpse of something massive moving between the trees, keeping pace with the truck. But I didn't slow down to look closer. I didn't stop until I'd put 5 miles between me and that ridge. When I finally pulled over to catch my breath, I realized I'd left the drone behind. Thousands of dollars of equipment abandoned in the wilderness. but the thought of going back made my skin crawl. This wasn't about gathering scientific data. Anymore, this was about survival. The wood knocks still echoed in my mind. That coordinated pattern that spoke of intelligence, and worse, of strategy. Whatever I'd been documenting had stopped being passive. It was actively hunting me now. I made it to my truck, hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The metal felt ice cold against my sweating palms. Behind me, the knocking had stopped, replaced by an expectant silence that felt even worse. I cranked the engine and threw the truck into reverse, tires spinning slightly on the wet ground before finding purchase. The first 100 yards of the dirt, access road passed in a blur. My heartbeat began to slow marginally as distance grew between me and that clearing. But then I saw them, fresh tracks in the mud, massive impressions that made my stomach lurch. They paralleled the road, appearing in regular intervals where the ground was soft enough to hold marks. I slowed briefly, professional instinct warring with fear. Each track was easily 16 inches long, with clear toe impressions and a depth that suggested immense weight. They weren't there when I'd driven in earlier. These were fresh, and they were following the road. Following me, the realization hit me like a physical blow. I pressed the accelerator, but the wet dirt road demanded caution even in my panic. The tracks kept pace, appearing in my headlights with terrible regularity. Some seemed to show a running stride, the distance between them growing to match my increasing speed. A flash of movement caught my eye, something massive and dark moving through the trees to my left, keeping pace with the truck. The headlights caught only glimpses, a shoulder higher than a bear's would be, dark fur, fluid motion that spoke of raw power. My hands clenched the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I floored it, no longer caring about the treacherous road conditions. The truck fishtailed slightly, but I managed to keep control. 50 miles per hour on a logging road was suicide, but the alternative seemed worse. The engine roared in protest as I pushed it harder. The figure in the trees matched my speed effortlessly. It moved with a terrible grace, navigating the rough terrain as easily as I drove the road. Every few seconds, my headlights would catch another glimpse, an arm longer than any human's. The flash of eyes reflecting in the darkness. The suggestion of massive shoulders clearing branches that would stop a man cold. The road curved sharply, and I nearly lost control. The truck's back end slid in the mud, and I fought the wheel, heart in my throat. When I recovered, I caught my last clear view of my pursuer. It stood at the tree line, where the road straightened out, fully visible. For just a moment, 8, maybe 9 feet tall, barrel-chested, with arms that hung below its knees. The headlights illuminated it clearly, and there was no mistaking this for a bear or any other known animal. Then it simply melted into the darkness between the trees, gone as if it had never been there. But I didn't slow down. I kept the accelerator, pressed to the floor until the dirt road gave way to gravel, and then to blessed pavement. Only when I reached the main highway did I ease off the gas, hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. The tracks had told the truth. Something impossible had paced my truck through the wilderness, matching 50 miles per hour through rough terrain as easily as I drove the road. The professional part of my mind, the part that documented and measured and analyzed, was already trying to rationalize what I'd seen. But the older part of my brain, the part that knows when we're being hunted, screamed that I'd just escaped. Something ancient and powerful. Something that had merely chosen to let me leave its territory. I drove through the night, putting as much distance as possible between myself and those dark woods. The image of that figure kept replaying in my mind, its fluid grace, its impossible speed, and most unnervingly, its deliberate choice to reveal itself fully at the end. Like a warning, like a message, I pulled into the consultancy's parking lot at 7:30 in the morning, exhausted but determined. The office building looked deceptively normal, all glass and steel. Nothing like the primal terror I'd left behind in those woods. My hands were steady now as I gathered my equipment bag and the carefully organized notes. I'd spent half the night preparing. Sarah at reception barely glanced up as I badged in. The familiar fluorescent lighting and hum of office activity felt surreal after what I'd experienced. I made my way to Doug Henderson's office, our project lead. He was already there, coffee in hand, reviewing something on his dual monitors. "Kevin, you're early. How'd the survey go?" His casual tone made my throat tighten. I placed my field notebook and the external hard drive on his desk. "We need to talk about what I found up there." My voice sounded strange, even to me, too controlled, too careful. For the next 45 minutes, I walked him through everything. The drone footage, corrupted but still showing fragments of that massive figure. My detailed field notes, including measurements of the tracks, timestamps of the wood knocks, and GPS coordinates of every significant location. I'd even managed to take photos of some of the tracks near the road before fleeing. Doug's expression shifted from professional interest to concern, but not the kind I'd hoped for. He wasn't concerned about what was in those woods. He was concerned about me. "Kevin," he said finally, leaning back in his chair, "the image quality here is extremely poor. Between the corruption and the distance, these could be shadows, lens artifacts, anything really." He gestured at my field notes. "And tracks can be misidentified, especially in poor light conditions." "I know what I saw," I insisted, keeping my voice level. "The pattern of behavior, the intelligence behind it." "Listen," he cut in, not unkindly. "The client needs usable moose population data. This," he tapped the hard drive, "isn't that? I'll have to list it as equipment failure and poor data quality." I left his office an hour later, the weight of dismissal heavy on my shoulders. But I wasn't done. I drove straight to the sheriff's office, where Deputy Collins had taken my initial report. The deputy's reaction was even worse than Doug's. He barely glanced at the new evidence, making non-committal noises while obviously waiting for me to finish. "Mr. Madsen," he said finally, "we've got real issues to deal with. Missing hikers, break-ins, traffic accidents. I can't justify allocating resources to investigate what's most likely just wildlife encounters misinterpreted." My last stop was Ranger Station 7, where I'd spoken to Ranger Martinez before. She at least took the time to review everything carefully, but her conclusion was the same. "Kevin, I've been working these forests for 12 years, she said, handing back my notebook. "Yes, we find unusual things sometimes. Yes, there are incidents we can't easily explain. But officially pursuing this, it would be career suicide." You understand. I did understand, all too well. Driving home, I realized I'd hit a wall of professional self-preservation. No one wanted to risk their credibility by officially acknowledging what I'd documented. The evidence would be filed away and forgotten, marked with bureaucratic language that drained it of meaning. Poor data quality, insufficient verification, inconclusive findings. But I knew what I'd seen, what had stalked me through those woods, what had matched pace with my truck on that terrifying drive out. The truth was out there in those mountains, whether anyone wanted to acknowledge it or not. And I was the only one who seemed to care about what that meant. I pulled into my driveway. As evening settled in, the weight of isolation heavy on my shoulders. The truth was mine alone now, and I had no idea what to do with it. The morning sun had barely crested the ridge when I launched the drone again. My hands trembled slightly as I checked the battery levels and signal strength, both optimal. After what I'd seen in the previous flights, every pre-flight check felt crucial. The crisp autumn air bit at my exposed skin as I guided the drone up to 1,000 feet. Scanning the dense forest canopy below, I had positioned myself on a natural overlook this time, giving me clear sightlines across the valley. The location wasn't random. I'd chosen it carefully after noticing patterns in the tree breaks and tracks from my earlier surveys. If there was something out there watching me, I wanted to see it first. The drone's camera feed showed pristine wilderness rolling out beneath me. I methodically began my survey pattern, keeping one eye on the thermal imaging display. 40 minutes into the flight, movement caught my attention, something large shifting through the trees about half a mile north of my position. My heart rate spiked as I adjusted the camera angle. Through the drone's lens, I could make out a dark figure moving with deliberate purpose between the trees. It wasn't the erratic movement of a bear or the graceful lope of a moose. This was something that walked upright, something that seemed to understand sight lines and cover. I zoomed in as much as the camera would allow. The figure paused in a small clearing, and I felt my blood run cold. It was looking up, not at the drone, but directly at my position on the overlook. Even at this distance, I could tell its posture was wrong for any known wildlife. Too tall. Too aware. This isn't random, I whispered to myself, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. The figure remained motionless, maintaining its unnerving focus on my location. It wasn't startled by the drone. It wasn't fleeing or hiding. It was observing me, just as I was observing it. My hands began to shake as I considered the implications. Every encounter so far, the tracks paralleling my path, the knocks that seemed to herd me in certain directions, the scratches on my truck, they weren't chance encounters. This thing knew I was here. It had been watching me, maybe even following my movements through its territory. The figure finally moved again, deliberately stepping behind a massive pine tree and disappearing from view. I kept the drone hovering, scanning the area, but it was gone. The way it moved spoke of intelligence, of purpose. This wasn't just some undiscovered animal acting on instinct. This was something that understood surveillance and counter-surveillance. Checked my drone's battery. 15 minutes of flight time remaining. I could continue the search pattern, try to relocate the figure, maybe get clearer footage. The scientific part of my brain screamed for more data, more evidence. But a deeper, more primal part of me understood that I was no longer the observer. Here, I had become the observed by finger, hovered over the controls as I wrestled with the decision. Continue filming and risk antagonizing whatever was out there, or retreat while I still could. The weight of the choice pressed down on me like a physical thing. I had a contract to fulfill, evidence to gather, but I also had a growing certainty that I was dealing with something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The drone's low battery warning chirped, forcing my hand. As I initiated the return sequence, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed some invisible line. The figure had revealed itself deliberately, letting me know I was being watched. It wasn't just a subject of study anymore. It was an active participant in whatever was unfolding here in these remote woods. I packed up my equipment with trembling hands, constantly scanning the tree line. The overlook that had seemed strategic now felt exposed. Whatever was out there, it knew where I was. And somehow, that felt like more than just data for a survey report. It felt like a warning. I arrived at the survey site well before sunrise, my truck's headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. This would be my final flight, one way or another. The memory of that watching figure from yesterday still haunted me, but I needed conclusive footage to either validate my experiences or put this nightmare to rest. My hands moved mechanically through the pre-flight checks as the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky. Battery at 100%, camera systems operational, GPS signal strong. I had positioned myself on a different ridge this time, one that offered both good visibility and a quick path back to my vehicle if needed. As the drone lifted off, I noticed how unnaturally quiet the forest had become. No early morning birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Each snap of a twig or shift of branches felt amplified in the stillness, making my skin prickle. I guided the drone in a wider pattern than usual, maintaining maximum distance from the areas where I'd previously spotted activity. Yet somehow, each sweep of the camera seemed to pull me further into the range. Strange formations in the trees, patterns that looked almost deliberate, kept drawing my attention deeper into the wilderness. The forest below appeared different through the drone's camera, more threatening, more alive. What had once been familiar terrain now felt like hostile territory. Every shadow could conceal something, watching, waiting. The deeper I flew into the range, the stronger the sensation grew that I wasn't conducting a survey anymore. I was being led somewhere. The wilderness itself seemed to have turned against me, each natural sound now carrying undertones of menace. The morning light, rather than bringing clarity, only cast deeper shadows among the trees. The drone's camera suddenly locked onto something moving between the trees. My heart nearly stopped. There it was again, but closer this time, much closer than yesterday. The figure appeared massive against the forest backdrop, its dark form clearly bipedal. I frantically adjusted the camera settings, desperate to capture clear footage, but the video feed began breaking up into digital artifacts. No, no, no. I shouted at my control screen as static overwhelmed the signal. The interference grew worse until the screen went completely dark. In that same moment, my radio crackled with harsh static before dying completely. The silence that followed was deafening, until it was broken by 3 distinct wood knocks echoing through the trees to my left. They were loud, deliberate, and clearly not natural. My hands trembled as I tried to restart the drone's systems. More knocks answered from my right, closer this time, then behind me. The realization hit me like ice water. I was being surrounded. Branches cracked in the underbrush. Something large was moving through the forest, circling my position. Whatever I'd been filming was now hunting me. This wasn't a research project anymore. This was about survival. I abandoned the drone controller and grabbed my backpack, not even bothering to collapse the antenna. The movement around me grew closer, accompanied by a deep, musky odor that made my nose burn. Heavy footfalls crunched through the forest litter, matching my pace as I half stumbled back toward my truck. My scientific detachment evaporated with each step. The thing I'd been studying was now studying me, and I had no intention of becoming the subject of its attention. The truck was 300 yards away, but it felt like miles. I threw myself into the truck's cab, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I cranked the steering wheel hard, spraying gravel as I turned onto the narrow dirt road. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. Through the windshield, the beam of my headlights caught something. That made my blood run cold. There, in the fresh mud along the road's edge, were tracks, massive prints that paralleled my route. They hadn't been there when I'd driven in this morning. Each impression was easily 15 inches long, with clear toe marks pressed deep. Into the soft earth, I pushed the accelerator harder, but the tracks kept appearing in my headlights, fresh and glistening wet. Whatever made them was moving alongside me, just beyond the reach of my lights. The forest pressed in close on both sides of the road, branches scraping against the truck's sides. Movement caught my eye. Something enormous shadowed the tree line, to my right, keeping pace with my vehicle. Even at 30 miles per hour, it matched my speed with terrible ease. The shape was dark, massive, and moved with a fluid grace that defied its size. My headlights briefly caught a glimpse of matted fur and powerful limbs before it melted back into the darkness. Pure terror seized me. I slammed the accelerator to the floor, the truck's engine screaming in protest as I pushed it to its limits. Mud and gravel sprayed from my tires as I fishtailed around the curves, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever was pursuing me. Only when the dirt road finally gave way to pavement did I stop seeing movement in my rearview mirror. The next morning, I walked into the consultancy's regional office with my hands still trembling, clutching the drone's SD card and my field notes. Sarah, my project coordinator, listened patiently as I explained what had happened, but I could see the skepticism growing in her eyes with each passing minute. "I understand your concerns, Kevin," she said, carefully choosing her words, "but most of this footage is corrupted, and what we can see, well, it's inconclusive at best. The quality is too poor for our scientific standards." I spread my field notes across her desk, pointing to the detailed sketches of the tracks, the time stamps of the wood knocks, the GPS coordinates. "Look, I know what I saw. Something's out there, something that doesn't match any known species." She gathered my materials into a neat pile and slid them into a manila folder. "We'll review everything, but I have to be honest. This likely won't make it into the final report. We need hard data for our wildlife surveys, not anomalies. Frustrated, I drove to the sheriff's office. Deputy Martinez, who had heard my initial report, was even less receptive this time. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Mr. Madsen, we simply can't allocate resources based on unclear drone footage and some tracks that could be explained by any number of natural causes." The ranger I'd spoken to before, Thompson, was equally dismissive. "Look," he said, lowering his voice, "even if there was something to this, which I'm not saying there is, we can't risk the department's reputation chasing shadows. I'd strongly suggest you let this go." Standing in the parking lot afterward, watching government officials go about their day as if nothing had happened, the truth hit me hard. I was completely alone with what I knew. No one was going to help me prove what I'd experienced in those woods. That evening, I typed up my resignation letter. My hands were steady now, steadier than they'd been in days. I couldn't continue the contract, not after what I'd experienced. The thought of returning to those remote valleys, of seeing that massive shape through my drone's camera again, no amount of money was worth that risk. Within a week, I'd packed up my apartment in Boise. The drone equipment sat in its cases, untouched since that final flight. I couldn't bring myself to sell it, but I knew I'd never use it for wilderness surveys again. Some doors, once opened, are better left closed. I moved east, taking a job in urban development that kept me firmly within city limits. Sometimes, during sleepless nights, I still replay those moments in my mind. The corrupted footage, the wood knocks echoing across the timberline, those massive tracks in the mud, and that terrifying pursuit along the forest road. People ask me, sometimes, usually around campfires or at bars, why I gave up such interesting work. I tell them this: the wilderness isn't just trees and rocks and animals. There's something else out there, something that watches and waits, something that's been there long before us and will remain long after we're gone. My warning is simple, and I hope anyone who ventures into those remote places will heed it. If you're alone in the forest and you feel eyes on you, if the birds go silent and the air grows thick with that prehistoric musk, don't wait around trying to prove anything. Don't reach for your camera. Don't try to be a hero. Just leave, because by the time you see it step into the open, it's already too late. The truth about what stalked me in those Idaho mountains remains unresolved. Maybe that's for the best. Thanks for watching. If any part of this story lingered with you, consider subscribing. I'll be here again tomorrow, sharing another tale that speaks to the soul.